Hello and welcome to CG Visuals. My name's Zach, and today we'll learn how to create realistic firebending simulations inside of Adobe After Effects and Trapcode Particular 3. So without further ado, let's get started. Now that we've opened After Effects, let's take a closer look at the effect we'll be creating today. We'll cover the techniques used to achieve an advanced firebending trail that spirals towards the camera. We'll also take our simulation into the compositing stage to help integrate the visual effect into our scene. Before beginning, open the project settings window and increase the depth to 32 bits per channel. This will allow us to display a wider range of colours. You'll also want to download the tutorial files provided in the video description and save them to a suitable location. These include custom assets, sprites and various effects presets which we'll be using later in the video. So to begin, we'll start by creating a new composition, setting the duration to 15 seconds and choosing the HD TV 1080p preset. We'll start things off by creating a default 35mm camera and then create a new null object called Emission Locator. Since we're going to use this to control the position of our particles, we'll also want to enable it as a 3D layer. At this stage, we need to decide how and where our fire trail is going to travel. The best way to do this is to loosely plot down the desired course, keeping the keyframes evenly spaced apart. Once you're done, select all the keyframes in the animation and then right-click to enable keyframe assistance. With the keyframe selected, open the graph editor and click on the Separate Dimensions icon and the Fit All Graphs to View button. Using the motion path handles, adjust each of the keyframes to smooth out the overall curve of the motion path. After taking some time to refine the animation, create a new point light and rename it to Motion Path 1, making sure to capitalize the first letters. The next step is to adjust the motion path so that it roughly occupies the same 3D space as the emission locator. One way to do this is to toggle the active camera between various orthographic views and adjust the motion path so that it sits slightly off-center. Then if we parent the motion path to the emission layer, it will inherit the animation while also being allowed to move independently. For example, if we animate the rotation of the emission layer, the motion path will now orbit around in circles, creating a unique spiraling animation. Now that the initial setup is complete, we can start adding our particles. Create a new solid and from the effects menu choose Trapcode Particular. First we need to head into the Physics tab and under Air select Motion Path 1. By default the particles won't be aligned to the motion path, so to fix this, copy and paste the position values from the emission locator to the position values in Trapcode Particular. The particles will now animate along the specified motion path. After some initial testing, you may wish to make additional tweaks to the rotation speed as well as other minor adjustments. Just be aware that after making those changes, you may need to recache the simulation by adjusting the random seed value to ensure that those changes are updated in the viewer. In order to streamline this process moving forward, create a new null object called Particle Controls, then from the Effects menu, add a slider control and rename it to Randomize Simulation. If we expand the Emitter menu and Alt-left click on the Random Seed option, we can use the Pick Whip tool to connect this value to the slider, which will make it more convenient to access in future. From the project window, import the custom sprites which are included in the tutorial files. You can drag and drop the smoke sprite into the project window, but for the fire sprites, we'll want to import them as a JPEG sequence. Start by dragging the sprites into a new composition, 100 by 100 pixels, and change the duration to 6 seconds. Once both sequences are on the timeline, arrange them as follows so that they appear equal in scale. Then from the project window, drag the animated fire sprites comp into the main particles comp. Now it's time to begin transforming our boring particles into realistic fire. We'll start by reducing the lifetime of the particles so that they disappear just off screen. Then we'll change the particle type to use a sprite and choose the animated fire sprite layer from the composition. Select random still frame for the time sampling and experiment with the random seed options. If we increase the size to 50, we'll see our particles more clearly, but they seem to have a distinct black box around them. This is because, by default, they don't include a pre-multiplied alpha channel, but this can easily be resolved by enabling the unmult option in Trapcode Particular. You may have noticed that the first particle at the front is behaving strangely. When using motion paths, it's best to avoid spawning particles on frame 0 before the animation of the motion path has been calculated. To resolve this, we'll keyframe the particles per second so that they start at 0 and then stop animating after about 3 seconds. Going back to the Particles tab, increase the size randomness to 50 and then open the rotation controls. Change the random speed distribution to a value of 2 and the speed rotation factor to 1. Open the size over life curve and select the following preset. Set the opacity and the opacity randomness to 50 and then copy the custom size over life curve into the opacity over life graph. Next, we'll jump into the Physics tab and increase the air resistance to 1, the spin amplitude to 25, and then open the turbulence field options. Think of this as a 3-dimensional fractal noise effect that influences the particles. We'll start by increasing the effect size to 25, the effect position to 1000, and the fade-in time to a value of 2 seconds. Decreasing the scale factor to 0.5 will decrease the complexity of the field, resulting in larger, organic-looking movements. Visualizing the fields will help to illustrate this, as we continue to change the octave scale to 1 and the evolution speed to 100. These settings will require some experimentation, but as a general rule, we recommend trying to use the turbulence field option to create large, organic patterns. After previewing the effect, it might be a good idea to go back and refine the size and opacity over life curves, especially if the fire is fading in too slowly. After some initial tweaking, it's time to preview the simulation with motion blur, which is crucial for selling the effect. Finally, we'll enable the use of auxiliary particles by changing the emission type to continuous. Set the particles per second to 15, the velocity to 25, inherit main velocity to 75, lifetime to 0.3, and the life randomness to 50. Increase the size to 75, the size randomness to 50, and choose the following preset for the size over life graph. For the opacity over life, we'll start with a linear ramp preset and then modify it so that it resembles the example on screen. Then we'll change the opacity and the opacity randomness to 100. Scroll down to the Physics tab and set the gravity to -2500, the air resistance to 1 and the turbulence position to 100. We can also add some random rotation to the auxiliary particles by changing the rotation speed to 1. We also need to switch the particle type from inherit main to an independent sprite-based system. Select the animated fire sprite layer and change the time sampling method to random from still frame. This should eliminate any visible repetition. Finally, re-enable the motion blur and perform a quick preview render to make sure everything is working correctly. Rename the Trapcode particular layer to Fire Particles and then press Ctrl D to duplicate. We'll rename the second layer to Ember Particles and solo the layer to improve performance. In the Particles tab, change the particle type to a cloudlet and set the scale to 5. We'll also need to change the auxiliary particles to use a cloudlet, setting the scale to 1.5. Going back to the Particles tab, set the opacity to 0 so that only the auxiliary particles are visible. Enable color over life for the particles and then customize the graph so that it gradually fades from light orange to dark red. Currently, this isn't affecting the auxiliary particles, so to fix this, increase the colour from main percentage to 100. After previewing the effect at full res, the biggest issue appears to be the motion blur samples. Since the linear accuracy controls are currently greyed out, we'll have to temporarily switch the main particle type back to a sprite to gain access to those controls. This will allow us to fix the issue by increasing the motion blur samples to 70 before changing the particle type back to a cloudlet. If the embers look like they're spawning in too quickly, we can also delay the emission start time in the auxiliary controls. The particles per second are optional, but if you're going for something more subtle, try reducing them to 5. Increase the velocity to 100, inherit main velocity to 50, the lifespan to 1, life randomness to 75, and experiment with a value between 1 and 2 for the size. Scroll down to the Physics tab, reduce the gravity to -500 and the turbulent position to 2000. Finally, in the Physics Master tab, try increasing the spin amplitude until you achieve the desired level of wind turbulence. After previewing the effect, change the blending mode of the Ember Particles to lighten to help blend the layers more naturally. Next, we'll add some smoke to the simulation by selecting the Fire Particles layer and duplicating it. We'll then rename it to Smoke Trail. Bring in the smoke sprite from earlier by dragging it onto the timeline, then in the particle controls, change the animated sprite to the newly added smoke sprite. We'll do the same thing for the auxiliary particle controls as well. Open the rotation controls and increase the random rotation to 100. Then in the particle controls, reduce the opacity to 0 so that only the auxiliary smoke is visible. Going back to the auxiliary controls, reduce the particles per second to 5, the velocity to 100, inherit main velocity to 50, the lifespan to 2 seconds, and the size to 250. In the auxiliary physics controls, set the gravity to 0, reduce the opacity to 15, and then modify the opacity over life graph so that the smoke fades in and out of existence more naturally. For the size over life, we want the smoke to gradually increase in size, as represented by the example on screen. On second thoughts, let's hop back into the auxiliary physics controls and reduce the gravity to -300 so that the smoke slowly rises over time. If the smoke appears to rotate too quickly, we can also experiment by enabling air resistance rotation in the master physics controls. Finally, we'll change the blending mode of the smoke trail to soft light. However, we also want the smoke to react to the fire particles. To do this, we'll need to duplicate the fire particles layer one last time and rename it to Smoke Illumination, positioning it below the smoke trail layer. Open the particle controls and change the particle type to a sphere. Disable the auxiliary particles to improve performance. Going back to the Particles tab, reduce the feather amount to 25, increase the size to 100, the opacity to 100, and change the colour over life ramp to a mixture of pale yellow and neutral brown. In the Layers panel, change the blending mode to Screen and the Track Matte option to use the alpha channel of the smoke trail. Now it's time to start adding custom shaders and effects to our simulation. To speed up this process, we've included a list of custom effects presets in the tutorial files. First, select the Fire Particles layer and from the Animation menu choose Apply Animation Preset. Then simply navigate to the tutorial files folder and apply the Animated Fire Particles shader. This will automatically apply a host of additional effects to the simulation, which you can review at your leisure. Moving on to the Ember Particles, we've included an animated preset called Heat Distortion, which you can adjust as needed. For the Smoke Trail, we'll also apply the same Heat Distortion effect, but we'll customize it slightly by increasing the size to 20. We've also included a preset for the Smoke Illumination layer called Smoke Illumination Glow, which will help to brighten and blur out the effect. Finally, if we preview all the layers together, you'll notice that it resembles log footage, which by default usually looks quite flat. This is done deliberately to complement the final layer of color correction. Create a new adjustment layer and position it above the Ember Particles. Rename it to 32-bit color correction, and then from the animation menu choose the 32-bit fire shader. Suddenly our flat image is transformed into a vibrant fire simulation, but it doesn't stop there. We'll create one last adjustment layer called Compound Blur and change the blending mode to Lighten. From the effects menu, simply add a compound blur, increase the maximum blur radius to 100 and select the inverted checkbox option. Now if we dial back the opacity to say 25, it creates a realistic camera haze effect that smooths out the highlights. Let's perform one last preview render to make sure everything is working correctly. Then, from the tutorial files, import the large fluid fire asset and drag it onto the composition. We'll solo the following layers and enable the fire asset as a 3D layer. Initially it will disappear, but to fix this, simply open the material options for the layer and just disable the Accept Lights and Shadows option. Adjust the anchor point so that it sits at the base of the fire, and then expand the position controls for both the fire asset and the emission locator. Making sure you have frame 0 selected, copy and paste the position values from the emission locator to the corresponding position values of the fire asset. Right click on the fire asset and from the time menu choose the time stretch option. Reducing the time factor to 50 will essentially double the playback speed, and we can also offset the layer if needed. Reposition the asset above the fire particles layer and change the blending mode to Lighten. Then from the effects menu, create a mesh warp and reduce the rows and columns to 2. Adjusting the mesh handles allows us to morph the fire asset so that it vaguely conforms to the motion path. Select all of the color correction presets from the fire particles layer and copy and paste them into the newly added fluid fire asset. Finally, we'll pre-compose everything into a pre-comp layer to keep things organized, and then we'll create a new composition specifically for the purposes of compositing. From the project window, select the particles pre-comp and then drag it into the new composition. Now we can focus on the final stage, compositing the effect into a live action plate. First, we'll import the heat displacement map included in the tutorial files, and we'll also import a stock image to act as our background plate. Drag the image into the composition and adjust the scale if needed. Since we need to adjust the camera slightly, we'll temporarily copy and paste the background image into the particles comp just to use as a reference. If we solo the fire particles, it will improve performance, allowing us to match the camera to our existing plate. This is where the benefit of having a procedural simulation starts to pay off. Because it exists in 3D space, we can easily render this effect from any perspective. Once the camera has been adjusted, go ahead and remove the plate from the particles comp. We'll also re-enable all of the hidden layers before heading back into the export comp. Now it's time to use the art of compositing to take our fire from passable to as close as photorealistic as possible. We'll start by selecting the particles pre-comp, and from the animation menu, apply the comp fire grade preset. Duplicate the pre-comp layer and change the blending mode to Lighten. Then if we dial back the opacity for the original layer to around 50, it will provide all of the benefits of an additive or screen transfer mode without sacrificing the opacity and thickness of the flames. But we're not done yet. Create a new white solid called Comp Glow and apply the Comp Glow preset from the tutorial files. Then in the Set Matte effect, select the particles pre-comp as the alpha channel. Change the blending mode to screen and adjust the fast blur depending on how close the fire is to the camera. For this particular shot, I've reduced the glow to 70 by lowering the opacity, and I've also used a feathered mask so that it's more pronounced on one side. Let's create another white solid called Light Glare and position it below the main effect. Then from the animation menu, add the Light Glare preset, but change the set matte effect to use the Particles pre-comp instead. The CC cross blur adds horizontal light streaks which can be adjusted. We'll also change the blending mode to screen and reduce the opacity to around 60%. The last adjustment layer is for the heat distortion, which is where our heat distortion map comes into play. Create a new composition for the heat distortion and drag the displacement map into the layers panel. Increase the scale to a value of 200 and change the blending mode to hard light. Then we'll duplicate and offset the asset several times until it encompasses the entire length of the shot. If you want to see the heat distortion fade to 0, create a 50% grey solid to cover the remaining length. From the project window, import the heat displacement map into the export comp and create a new white solid called Alpha Matte. From the effects menu, create a set matte effect and redirect it to use the blue channel of the Particles pre-comp layer. Create an extract effect and change the channel type to alpha. Adjust the white and black point controls to create an inverted matte that excludes the core of the fire. Use a curves adjustment to boost the alpha channel and a fast blur to soften the edges. Going back to the layers panel, add a motion tile to the heat distortion adjustment layer and expand the output height and width controls with the mirror edges checkbox enabled. Create a compound blur effect and select the heat displacement map as the blur layer with a maximum blur radius of 1. From the effects menu, add a displacement map, set the displacement map layer to use the heat displacement map pre-comp and increase the maximum horizontal displacement to a value of 10. Finally, in the layers panel, change the track matte option to use the alpha channel. Let's preview the completed effect to see if there's anything else we can improve on. There only seems to be one thing missing, and that's the snow particles. Luckily, I have a pre-rendered asset of some snow that I can simply drag and drop into the composition. And of course, you can download this clip along with a whole library of free VFX assets directly from our YouTube channel page, CG Visuals. Just scroll down to the free VFX assets light weather pack and download the files. All of the assets from CG Visuals are royalty free and available for both personal and commercial use. Here you can also see the snow asset featured in the Avatar Bending teaser video. Going back to After Effects, drag the snow asset into the composition and simply change the blending mode to soft light. To render this out as a final comp, go to the composition menu and select Add to Render Queue. Change the format type to a QuickTime and the format options to either a Photo JPEG or one of the DVC Pro formats. Once you've specified an output file path location, you can begin your render. Just be aware that at full res it will take significantly longer to render, but after about an hour you'll have a highly realistic and professional looking effect to use in your projects. If you're looking for more realistic fire effects, check out Trapcode Fire version 2.3. It's a collection of 15 highly customizable After Effects and Trapcode particular-based project files, designed to make creating and compositing realistic fire affordable, time-efficient, and easy to use, regardless of your skill level. So if you're interested, check out the description for more information. If you enjoyed this video and would like to stay tuned for more content, subscribe to CG Visuals for advanced Trapcode particular tutorials and royalty-free VFX assets for your films. We'll see you soon, and thanks for watching.